I have gotten a lot of requests to give you guys an updated rest of season top 12 defense rankings, and since I always look at fantasy football in terms of 4 quarters, it is time to give you guys the rest of season rankings at the defense position. And I'm one of the only fantasy YouTubers who covers defense on a weekly basis multiple times, so make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So going down to our first tier right here, we've got the Vikings defense at number 1. So with the Minnesota Vikings defense, you already know this is the top performing defense so far. Like, you think back to the Cowboys last year, this is what the Vikings defense is doing. 14 fantasy points per game. That's your wide receiver 1. That's your running back 1. They're averaging more than 4 sacks per game. They're averaging 2 interceptions and 2 fumble recoveries per game. They are all over the field. Brian Flores, if not the best, is one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL right now. But here's the thing with Minnesota, right? This is also why I draw the comparison to the Cowboys last year. If you remember, the Cowboys were a must-start like every single week for the first, 3 months of the year. Basically, most of the year they were a must-start regardless of who they played. But then they had a really rough playoff schedule where a lot of opponents they were facing were top-scoring offenses, and the Cowboys ended up not doing very well. So it's important to know as I go through the Vikings schedule here that you do not, I rarely will endorse adding a defense and just putting that defense in cruise control on your team in your starting lineup every single week. I very rarely make that recommendation here. So looking at the Vikings schedule, you've obviously got the Jets here in week 5. You've got easy matchups like Tennessee and Chicago in week 11 and 12. And I would add in Jacksonville at week 10 because I think the Jags by then are going to be a broken team, possibly without a head coach. Arizona's a toss-up. We'll see how they end up finishing. And then the Chicago Bears, obviously, since it's in division, they get them right at the beginning of playoff time. Now, it's important to remember here that with this playoff schedule, they play the Packers on championship week. The Packers, obviously, they did really well against defensively in fantasy, even though they gave up like 29 points. So the Vikings defense, it really doesn't matter right now what the matchup is, but they do have a good stretch here. So with the Vikings defense, overall, I think just the way they're playing, how many guys are just firing on all cylinders and how aggressive they're playing defensively, they're at my number 1 spot. Now, dropping down to number 2, the Chargers defense, I've got them personally at number 2. Now, you might be saying, where's the Packers defense, right? Why aren't they at number 2? Why aren't the Bears at number 2? We'll get to those defenses here soon. With the Los Angeles Chargers defense here, they're also a very good defense. If you take out that game against really the Pittsburgh Steelers, they've been really, really solid defensively. 9.5 fantasy points per game. They're averaging almost 3 sacks per game, and again, 2 turnovers per game. So the Chargers defense has been really good. Now, the problem they've faced recently is that Joey Bosa is obviously injured right now, and Derwin James got suspended in week 4. The good thing is they're on bye this week. So obviously, we're not going to have to worry about them getting healthy in advance for this week. We're worrying about them getting healthy in advance for next week. And obviously, Derwin James will be back from the suspension here. What I really love about the Chargers here is they've got several great stretches. They've got the Browns, then the Titans, and then the Bengals here. And while the Bengals are a better offense for sure than the Browns and the Titans, they are mistake prone. So that gives them a good fantasy upside week. They've also got to play the Broncos 2 more times here, and one of those times is included in the playoffs. And then they finish off the fantasy championship against New England in week 17, and depending on if your playoffs go to week 18, you might get the Las Vegas Raiders here. So with this schedule and with the Chargers here, I am personally counting on more elite play from the Chargers defense because, as I always say, Jim Harbaugh does 2 things. He plays really physical defense and he runs the ball down your throat. They're playing physical defense. They even did well against the Chiefs last week. I'm in on the Chargers defense long term. And then at number 3, rounding out this tier, the Packers defense. Yes, they are at number 3, and I love the Packers defense too. It's no shade to the Packers defense having the Chargers above them. They're averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game. They have been realistically like they haven't had a bad game this year. Against the Philadelphia Eagles was, along with the Vikings last week, their worst game, but in most platforms, they had like 7 or 8 fantasy points. These guys are, again, physical at point of attack. More than 3 sacks per game, and they're averaging 4 turnovers per game. That's insane. Their secondary is playing lights out football. They're ball hawks back there. Xavier McKinney, the safety, Jair Alexander when healthy. This secondary is lights out right now. So I really like the way the Packers are playing. And again, they've got some good matchups here, obviously with the Chicago Bears, right? Like, the Chicago Bears are mistake prone, their offensive line stinks, and I think that Shane Waldron has done a disservice for Caleb Williams in year one. And then you look at the Miami Dolphins, that one may be tougher because of Tua if he's eventually back, but ultimately I don't really think that's a bad matchup, to be honest with you. So they got the Jacksonville Jaguars in addition, right? They've got the New Orleans Saints, who are shaky offensively. So there's plenty of matchups here, and again, it's similar to the Vikings, where it's like they've proven to be kind of matchup proof so far. So does that continue? I have a little less confidence in them continuing that reign, less than I do with the Vikings doing it. But I do think that based on what we've seen, the Packers defense has been elite. That's why they're at number 3. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got the Bears defense at number 4 here. And again, the NFC North really has like plenty of great defenses in fantasy football terms. So obviously the Bears defense has kept them in so many matchups in the NFL at this point. It's ridiculous. They're averaging almost 11 fantasy points per game. And keep in mind, they played the Houston Texans, right? They have been keeping them afloat versus good offenses here. And with the Bears defense, they're averaging almost 3 sacks per game, and they're averaging over an interception per game. 2 turnovers per game between interceptions and fumble recoveries here. That secondary is so good, and their front 7 has been changed completely with Montez Sweat. And I'll give Matt Eberflus, I'll give him credit on this. He can coach a defense here. That's why the Bears are being kept in a lot of games, again, in the NFL terms. Now, with the Bears here, they don't have particularly strong matchups at any point, aside from like the New England Patriots being a really strong matchup. And I would argue this week the Panthers and next week the Jags are pretty good matchups as well. But again, this defense has really proven to be bust-proof. Like, that's the thing, is they're producing through sacks, through turnovers, and through just passes deflected because their secondary is a bunch of ball hawks. So I really like the Bears defense moving forward as well. And then to number 5, we've got the Broncos defense here. And the Broncos, I just keep saying this, man. That defense is so good. Like, the Broncos, very similar to the Bears, actually. Broncos haven't generated much offense in many games. The best game they had was against the Buccaneers offensively, but their defense has been keeping them in these matchups. That's how they beat the Jets last week. It wasn't because of offense. So the Broncos has been in games because of their defense, and I will namely note Pat Surtain, the cornerback who is a shutdown. I mean, he may be the best corner in the league, honestly. That guy is shutting down every number 1. The one he didn't shut down was George Pickens, and even that week, he didn't have a great fantasy week. So just a note on your wide receiver schedule, if you see Pat Surtain in the Denver Broncos, be cautious with him, because the Broncos defense is really legitimate. Not only is it Pat Surtain not allowing number 1 wide receivers to do well, they're getting a lot of coverage sacks, 4 sacks per game, and they've got injuries right now. This Bronco defense has done great. That's averaging 10.5 fantasy points per game. So again, looking at this schedule here, they play the Raiders twice. They obviously play the Browns. I think those are great matchups. The Chargers are a toss-up at some point. The New Orleans Saints are a toss-up. The Panthers are a toss-up. There's plenty of good opportunities here for the Broncos to continue doing really well in fantasy, and I just kind of want to be attached to a defense with this kind of talent, especially at the back end, who is shutting down number 1s. At number 6, I've got the Saints defense here, and with the Saints here, obviously, the past 2 weeks have not been as great. They're averaging 9.5 fantasy points per game, basically 3 sacks per game, 3 turnovers per game. So they're playing really good football. It's just that the past 2 weeks, you've seen their offense really kind of take a step back because they have Derek Carr, who's mistake prone, and he's very streaky as well. Not even Clint Kubiak can fix his past 2 weeks. So with the Saints, they do ultimately have offensive woes similar to the Broncos and the Bears. That's why they're in tier 2 and not in tier 1. The Saints here, I do think, are still just a really physical defense that will have great weeks in advance because they've got teams like the Giants coming up on docket, the Browns coming up on the docket, the Broncos, the Chargers, the Panthers. Great opportunities, and then in week 17, that fantasy championship game could be an eater against the Las Vegas Raiders. I just made that word up, I think. But the reality is the Saints defense is really good in fantasy. I wouldn't be deterred from their last 2 performances too much because the Saints will have better weeks. And then to round out this tier, the Steelers defense at number 7 here. Now, obviously, the Steelers defense, they disappointed a lot of people last week. Trust me, I'm a Steelers fan. They disappointed me just as soon as I basically was like, oh yeah, the Steelers defense is good. So I have a love-hate relationship with the Steelers. my fantasy analysis comes first. The reality with the Steelers defense and why they're not higher is because if you actually look at the stars on this team, TJ Watt, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Cam Hayward. Those guys are older guys. Minka's not that old, but TJ and Cam Hayward, they're probably heading towards, Cam Hayward's definitely out of the prime of his career. TJ's definitely heading towards the end of the prime of his career. And he looks great so far, but the problem that I've seen with the Steelers in recent years is typically they start to decrease in production in fantasy as the year goes on. Now, they definitely will have some more big performances. This is a very explosive and turnover-happy defense here. So, against the Las Vegas Raiders in Week 6, I think that could be a good game. I actually think they're going to do fine against the Cowboys and the Jets here. They've got the Giants before their bye week. So before their bye week, I think a lot of production will be front-loaded. Then their back half of the schedule is totally filled with divisional matchups here. And they do well against the Ravens and sometimes against the Browns, but historically with Joe Burrow, they have not done well against the Bengals. So do not be fooled by that green that you see there on the Bengals schedule right there. So they've got some tough opponents in the back half. I think a lot of it is going to be front-loaded, and they will have some disappointing weeks to end the season off with. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we've got the Colts defense. I know. The Colts defense at number 8. What are they doing here, right? They're they stick out like a sore thumb. They're averaging 6.8 fantasy points, and everybody else has basically been averaging like 9 at least. So what are they doing here? The Colts defense, if you actually look at them, now I have not been big on them for most of the season so far. There has been a couple games I thought they were good plays, but for the most part, I haven't been big. They're not like they were last year where they were really just creating turnovers a bunch and getting defensive touchdowns or special teams touchdowns. The Colts defense has been getting sacks though. 3 sacks per game, and if you look, they have probably the best strength of schedule moving forward here. The Jags in Week 5, the Titans in Week 6, Miami in Week 7 before Tua comes back. You've got teams like the New York Jets, who are definitely not at their best right now. The New England Patriots, the Denver Broncos, the Tennessee Titans again, and the Giants to end the year. So this team has so many plus matchups that I just think it's impossible for them to not be a top 10 defense moving forward with this type of schedule and with the talent that they do have on defense, specifically with DeForest Buckner in the front 7. I do think that the Colts will end up having really good weeks. Now, it won't be consistent. It won't be anything that I'll be ranking them in like the top 3 on because I don't think they're that great of a defense. But we're talking rest of season here. I think the Colts do end up as a top 10 defense rest of season from this point forward. Now at number 9 here, I've got the 49ers defense here. And the 49ers, they've done really well the last several weeks. I mean, really, if you just kind of take out that Patriots game last week though, they've been pretty mid. Like that Patriots game was definitely one to celebrate about because it was a 20-point fantasy week for a defense. But in reality, the 49ers have been a little less than impressed for the most part. That being said, they obviously have tons of talent. They've just been unhealthy up to this point. Javon Hargrave, he's done for the year. Ufunga, the safety, he's been in and out of the lineup so far. Really, they've got Fred Warner and Nick Bosa. They're just kind of the stalwarts in the front 7 right now, and their secondary is still a little bit shaky, to be honest. So with the 49ers, I do worry about this one because I don't particularly love their schedule either. Like, especially before their bye week, I don't think they have a lot of plus matchup opportunities. I think the 49ers will do fine against the Cardinals, but against the Seahawks, I don't know how to feel about that one. That one's a toss-up, to be honest with you. That's a divisional game. Seattle looks really good offensively, though. And then you come out of the bye week, you've got teams like the Bears, the Rams, the Dolphins late in the season, and that could be a really good stretch right there, and that's ultimately what I'm kind of counting on with this 49ers defense here. So just the physicality they showed the Patriots last week gives me encouragement, but I haven't seen that consistently enough throughout the year, so I've got them here at number 9. And then to round out this tier, I've got the Bills at number 10. The Buffalo Bills is also a shaky defense. Now, they performed better for the most part if you take out last week's game against the Baltimore Ravens where they got steamrolled. Like, you take that game out, the Bills defense has been really good. 3 sacks per game, interception per game, almost 2 turnovers per game when you factor in the fumble recoveries, and 1 forced fumble a game. 9.5 fantasy points because this defense is really well coached. Like, Sean McDermott has had injuries on that side of the ball as well. Terrell Bernard at the linebacker position, he's been injured. Their secondary's banged up. Like, Sean McDermott's a really good defensive coach. So just based on their talent and their coachability on defense and what they've done up to this point, I do think the Bills will be a top 10 defense. But again, there's a couple good ones here. Definitely. Like when you put in the Patriots, the Jets, I like those matchups potentially. When you take in the Dolphins, maybe they have Tua back by then. But ultimately the Dolphins, they get consistently hammered by the Bills, regardless of who the quarterback is. And then Tennessee in week 7. So they've got really good opportunities. And the thing about the Bills is they're so explosive. They're capable of these massive explosion games. So ultimately, I do like the Bills from a defensive perspective in fantasy moving forward, but not as much as I like other teams with better matchups, such as like the Colts, because I think the Colts have so many great matchups on docket. And to round out the whole thing, the last tier, the Ravens defense at number 11 here. The Ravens defense is starting to come on, right? Like they're starting to perform better. They haven't had a great fantasy game as of yet. Like even last week against the Bills, they weren't even fantastic fantasy-wise. That's why they're only averaging 7.8 fantasy points. But they're starting to come together. With a new defensive coordinator, Zach Orr, it's taken longer to gel than I would have preferred it to, but they've got talent all over the field. So 3.5 sacks basically, and a turnover per game basically, I do think has potential to become more because they've got teams like the Browns that they're going to start to play here pretty soon, right? They've got the Browns on docket. They've also got the Broncos on docket. They've got the Chargers on docket, the Steelers. Like there's opportunities here for good weeks for the Baltimore Ravens. And again, they're very similar to the Bills where they can steamroll teams and really not think twice about it. So there will be matchups where you don't even think to start them and they actually turn out to be a really good start. So overall, kind of taking that into account, I think the Ravens defense is still a top 12 defense. And then to round it out at 12, the Jets defense here at number 12. The Jets defense has been really good. Like if you really just factor it all in, Jets defense has been really solid in fantasy. 8.8 fantasy points per game. You take out that 49ers week 1 matchup, they've been really good in fantasy. So they're obviously, the past several years have been really good, averaging 3.5 sacks per game and over a turnover per game. Now, the one thing that's disappointing is their secondary right now is not very good. And their matchups, they do have good ones. Like, again, they get the Patriots. That's a blessing, and that's a total blessing right there. They also get the Cardinals, who are iffy. The Colts are iffy. The Seahawks, I don't like that matchup. The Miami Dolphins, though, I do. The Jags, at that time, I think are going to be a disaster. And the Rams are up in the air as well. So there is good potential here for the Jets to hit some really big games again. I ultimately just don't really consider them to be a top defense in fantasy long season because it comes from a lack of belief in the Jets as a team and where they're heading, because there already is issues here, mainly on the offensive side of the ball, like the drama with Breece Hall, the drama with Aaron Rodgers and the coaching staff. I ultimately do think it affects the defense because it has in past years where they've started really hot and then not finished quite as strong. So let me know what your team's record is at this point, and if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for week 5, click on this video right here.